There's a few of us, so all right. Well, this will be a good introduction for those who have not gone to see it, or who did not get to see it in its original form, I should say. And for those who did get to go, this will be a good kind of trip down memory lane. But it's also going to tell us a lot of things that we actually didn't know about the hotel until very recently, which are really kind of neat. So I promise you, we're all going to walk out of here with a kind of newfound love for the building and a newfound appreciation for what had always been. So of course, there we go. I am like I'm lecturing again at school. So we were built 1897 by Henry Plant. This makes the Bellevue the oldest operating hotel in Tampa Bay. Currently still operating, I should say. Of course, the only other hotel older in the area, there's two of them. There's the Detroit Hotel in downtown St. Pete and the Tampa Bay Hotel, neither of which are actually, you can't stay the night in them anymore. So this is the actual only hotel, the oldest hotel that you physically can still walk in, get a room for in the Tampa Bay region. And Henry Plant was known as the King of Florida, partially because he was considered more significant than Henry Flagler. Flagler wanted his name on all the roads and on the towns and in all the streets. Henry Plant was content with just what was built and kind of just that legacy left behind. And he actually had more business connections and kind of a much broader reach in the region's influence than Henry Flagler did. But because of the difference just in how they each had perceived their own selves, is why Flagler's name today is kind of associated on everything, everywhere. But Henry Plant himself was actually called the King of Florida. And so when Success Magazine did that, that's kind of neat. I mean, I love the quote that they have is, "Florida's not so much a commonwealth as a little kingdom of which Henry B. Plant is monarch. But he has an honest title for his money and enterprise made Florida what it is." You know, we tend to think of these robber barons coming in here and they're just developing everything they can have and letting it all basically for the rich while the rest of the common folk are kind of just building the towns nearby. But in reality, wherever the railroad went, prosperity followed. One of the biggest quotes you see both for the Biltmore and for Henry Plant in general, "The state of Florida blossoms like a rose at the touch of Henry Plant's magic wand." Because everywhere the railroad tracks were laid, prosperity had followed. We actually see an example in northern Florida. There used to be a town called Yellow Bluff. It was a steamship stop on the Swanee River. And once Henry Plant's railroad came through and connected the town to the outside world, they were so grateful to Henry Plant that they renamed Yellow Bluff to Branford. Branford being the town in Connecticut where Henry Plant was born. So we do see a lot of impacts in Florida once Plant really starts bringing the railroad into Flagler as well, of course. The other kind of neat thing about that, as much time has gone on, everybody does like the idea that Henry Plant and Henry Flagler were dueling tycoons kind of battling out for Florida. But in reality, they weren't best friends, but they were decently good friends in the sense that Henry Flagler first had the idea to come to Florida because he was an investor in Henry Plant's investment company. After about 2 years of directly working together, Plant did not have an interest on the Atlantic coast of Florida just because it was a little bit easier to get to the Caribbean from this side. So he told Flagler, all right, I'm really not interested in the East Coast if you'd like. There you go. And that's how Flagler got on the East Coast. So they weren't really, but as the decades have gone on, it's a lot easier just to think of them as kind of enemies in this. So much so, actually, that when Henry Plant dies in 1899, Henry Flagler is the chief pallbearer at the funeral, bringing the casket down in Connecticut. And that's just all been lost over the decades because we kind of like the idea that, you're battling it out for Florida. There we go. So of the plants, it's a little delay, I think.
I can do it for you.
Let's go forward.
You want to go backwards?
Yeah, there we go. There we go. So the plant system itself was a railroad system that had 2,700 miles of railroad tracks in the southeastern United States. It was the single largest railroad in the southeast. And it actually had started off very small. Following the Civil War, Henry Plant had been a transportation magnate in the sense of he had worked for a shipping company, predominantly originally with steamboats, then that kind of merged into trains. But then following the Civil War, so much of the South's rail infrastructure was destroyed that there wasn't really any possibility for any commerce. So Henry Plant, through the Southern Express Company that he was head of at the time, starts buying up all these failed railroads and starts rebuilding the tracks in the South. And as the 1870s turn into the 1880s, he starts moving further and further southward, arrives in Tampa in 1884, and that's actually when we have the first of Henry Plant's total of 8 hotels were built. And that was in 1886, and that was the Port Tampa Inn, the second one from the top on the right-hand side. That is in Port Tampa, which is kind of just north of McDill, over in Tampa. And this was the first hotel built because it was where the steamships that were going to connect the railroads to Cuba, it was just where you were waiting for them. So while you were waiting for the steamboat, you would have needed a place to stay for the night. Not a luxury hotel like you see from the others, but it was a start. That was the first one. It was built by the Plant system. The only other 2 hotels built expressly for Henry Plant as custom all-encompassing resorts was the Tampa Bay Hotel in 1891 and the Belleview in 1897. The rest of these hotels, the Ocala House, Punta Gorda Hotel, Seminole Hotel, Fort Myers Inn, and Kissimmee Hotel, all of those were actually built for other individuals, and then they were absorbed into the Plant system as it was expanding across the state. Really trying to push one of my friends, she's having a hard time with her thesis, and I'm really trying to tell her, like, you know what, focus maybe on the other hotels that had not ever been studied before, and look at the interplay of the relationship they had with the communities, both before and after Henry Plant came through, and then write something on that. She's getting discouraged because the school's telling her there's enough scholarship on Henry Plant. So I think we're just kind of in the central and the western Gulf Coast sides of the state. Of all of these, however, only about 2 asterisks do exist still to this day. Of course, in downtown Tampa, you do have the Tampa Bay Hotel, which is now the University of Tampa, who has not been to see it. Good. It's a wonderful, wonderful spot. They actually just did their annual fundraiser, event called Picnic in the Park. You dress up in period-appropriate attire, and they just put a Victorian-themed picnic on the front lawn of the building, and so you have probably 50, 60 folks in hoop skirts and 3-piece suits and just frolicking around the hotel like it was still a hotel. It's always very neat to do events like that. And so those are the only 2 still surviving, of course, the Bellevue in Bel Air, though not in its original form. And that's what we're about to get into. So we originally were built in the summer of 1896. Henry Plant purchased the land in what would become Bel Air in 1895, and a combination of a freeze later that winter, as well as the option to buy the other hotels kind of in the southern portion of the state, delayed construction for a year. So all the documentation we have says it took 2 years to build the hotel. The newer documentation says it only took about 6 months. Basement foundation was laid in June 1896, and the roof was completed by Halloween. But in that interim, they were really updating a lot of the design for this. And so what I will say, I don't want to say disclaimer, but at the beginning of this, we've learned so much about the hotel in the last 5 years because we have access to tools that historians did not have when the original building was still open. We have the internet, which has given us the ability to have digital photos, Flickr, digital newspapers. We can connect with people who might have stayed there decades ago that, oh, hey, yeah, I think I might have these photos here. Let me look and send them down to you. And so that's how we've been able to find out a lot of the updated information that we're going to be going over here. And that's what's fun about history, is you know what you know at the time, but there's always more to learn, and then that's when you update it. So 1896, we actually do not have the original blueprints of the building, and this is the only photo we've ever had of the building being built. It's the only one that survived. About a year ago, we had some folks walk in the lobby of the hotel, and they were taking pictures. We started talking. They're like, oh, we're friends with the family of the architect. I'm like, oh, you mean the architect from, a couple years ago when you redid the whole thing, right? They're like, no, we're pretty sure that's like the original architect. Okay. Long story short, we get put into touch with them. the grandson of the original architect. He's in like his 90s now. But the grandson is still alive, and his great-grandson now has all the family materials. And so we're on the phone talking, and I was telling him we only have one photo of construction and no other records. He's like, really? I have boxes of a few dozen sitting in my garage. We have the entire diary, day-by-day construction diary of the hotel. All these things. Oh, well, if you come up to Asheville, North Carolina, I'll let you scan them in. I have yet to do that, but I am still having him on speed dial, being like, when I have some time, I promise I will come up here and do this, because there are photos we've never seen of the building being built that we actually now, I was able to correlate them with some of the newspaper clippings we found of the hotel being expanded, and it's matching up a lot of the photos that he sent us, which filled in a lot of holes that I was looking for over the years. So that's kind of cool that we do still have this new stuff being found, and hopefully in a year I'll be able to go up and get them, because I really want those scanned in and say we're going to get all this put into the Pinella's Memory Project, and we have a tentative, the owner of the building has a tentative agreement with the Clearwater Historic Society to donate the entirety of the hotel's historic archives, everything that has always just been in the basement of the building. If I'm not there, I don't want it sitting there, so we're going to get it all donated out of the building so we don't get to lose it again. We actually lost the building's records once already in their entirety, and that was during World War II, which we will get to a little bit later as well, so we stay in order. But we don't want to lose any of these records again, so we're making sure that I'm putting the protocols in place to get them all preserved and digitized before we lose them again. There we go. So in the time that the hotel's kind of being designed and planned, Henry Plant also built a community in the area surrounding the hotel. This was common for Henry Flagler because Flagler was about 15 times wealthier. So he could go in and be like, all right, well, I'm going to build a hotel. There's no town here. I'm going to build the town to support the hotel. Henry Plant wasn't exactly able to do that. Bel Air was the only attempt he made at that before he died. And it partially was successful depending on how you look at it. So the original concept of Bel Air was surrounding the hotel. It was the hotel itself. I mean, the streets are still laid out this way for the most part. The hotel still exists in this little circle. This is kind of the main road in. This is Belleview Boulevard. That is Fort Harrison Road. And then this is Druid Road. So a lot of these roads are still here. And the settlement had actually built up around this area. So the intersection of D Street and Fort Harrison was the heart of Bel Air. And for those who drive through this section of Clearwater today, when you're going on Fort Harrison, you do still have A Street, B Street, D Street. Those are the original names of those streets that have always been there since the town was founded. As far as I know, the last original building, excluding the hotel, from Bel Air that was demolished, I think was in the late 80s or very early 90s, and it was a bar that was in a little wooden building right on the corner, green roof, white exterior, looked just like the hotel. But that is where the original settlement was. And it boomed for about 2 years, about 3 years, from 1897 when the hotel opened to right around the turn of the century. It was just a typical Florida pioneer boom town. Unfortunately, when Henry Plant dies, Morton Plant's focus really was on expanding the golf courses and promoting that. So what became originally the town of Bel Air Heights is what it was called. This started to expand to become the golf courses that are there today. So the settlement actually fizzled out almost immediately after Henry Plant died. It kind of like hung on for a little bit, but it never technically incorporated. And the incorporation, which we'll get to a little bit later, is actually for a second iteration of the town, and that's the one that we do have today. And so around this, so that was the original Bel Air. This is taken from the top of the water tower. This is looking west down D Street. Yeah. This is Fort Harrison right here. That bar that I was referring to, I finally got this picture verified, but the bar I was just talking about is actually, this is the back end of it right here. The McBullens had a store right over here on this side, and that's actually the hotel right up in the corner. The bicycle stadium, it's very hard to see, but that's technically this big sandy oval here. We have a picture of that coming up next. And then you can see the railroad spur that would back into the hotel that would bring all the guests. And this is the actual only major photo we have of the original Bel Air. The original photographer, his name was Louis Ducros. All the negatives were kept in his house, which does still exist nearby today, and it had always just stayed in the safe in that home. Decades later, it's the 1980s, it became a commercial business. The business inside the former home got burgled and the safe was stolen, which only contained the negatives, about 400 negatives of the original Bellevue Hotel, the original Bel Air, and everything in it. And they just never found those. Those in the 1980s. So antique stores are fun if you know what you're looking at, but the vast majority of the time, most things in there are unrecognizable to us. So this is the only surviving photo we have. We did find this one recently of the bicycle stadium that used to be there. And it was actually neat. Again, Henry Plant Hotel connected the plant system together. You have a minaret on top of this little bandstand right at kind of the beginning of the bike stadium here. So it does still connect that this is still the plant system that built the big palace over in Tampa. Oh, I'm waiting for this to go. I'll say the little sidebar fact we have of that is that also fizzled out when the town kind of did around 1900. John Taylor of Largo fame ends up purchasing the bicycle stadium, disassembles and uses the lumber to build the first packing home that he built in Largo from the wood from this, and we just found that out too. One of the advertisements that was done for the hotel, you can see the original building right on this side, much smaller, which
It's good forward.
Forward. Okay. That's fun. There we go. So the hotel, the bicycle stadium, Bel Air, all of this. Bel Air also, I should say, featured an opera house. It was the first opera house in Pinellas County. It did only exist for about 3 years, but all of this was built for the guests of the hotel. The ritziest, really kind of wealthiest folks in America at the time. Of course, a Gilded Age hotel of Plant and Flagler is going to attract these very, very high ends of people. Thomas Edison, of course, did illuminate the hotel. That was common with any Gilded Age person at the time, really. They would have known who he was. So he illuminated all the hotels for both gentlemen. It took a little bit of time, but I did verify that this picture is actually Bel Air. Because you can match up the buildings on the right-hand side of the picture. He's out on a fishing pier. So if you can match up the pictures, or the buildings on the right-hand side and the trees in the background with the other photo we have of the bathing pavilion, we actually were able to match it up to verify that, because it's very easy to say that that's Bel Air, but unless you can kind of conclusively prove, and there have been enough misconceptions about Bellevue Biltmore where we need to be making sure we're right before I say, oh yeah, this is Thomas Edison out on the fishing pier. Duke of Windsor came for 2 weeks for the 1953 season. He actually was a lot of fun. All the hotel guests at the time said he was really just a ball to kind of serve. Everybody was expecting a very kind of high-end royalty, take meals in his rooms and not really come out type thing. And he was joking with the guests. He was having fun. Nobody wanted to let him lose golfing, even though he was notoriously bad at golfing. And so he's out there with a golf pro, and he's like, how come you're losing? Aren't you supposed to be like one of the best in the world? It's like, well, Your Majesty, we don't want you to lose. And it's like, oh, come on. And so that was like one of the stories. And then, of course, that he lost miserably at that point. And Babe Ruth had another funny story with this, too, because, of course, he loved golfing as much as he did baseball. And he was there for about 12 years, just at the height of Pinellas County's role in spring training in this time. And the story with him was there was a golf ball that he had hit and got lost somewhere in the golf courses. They shut the whole game down. And it was $1 million to whoever could find Babe Ruth's missing golf ball. And it never was actually found. And every number of years, from what I've heard from the Bel Air Country Club, is they do find some like really old golf balls just somewhere. And so there's always the joke that, oh, that's Babe Ruth's golf ball. 2 years later, oh, here's my $1 million. And these were just a fraction. I mean, it's kind of neat. We had a list of about 24 celebrities that was made up in the 1990s, and we've about doubled that now that we actually have records to look back prior to World War II. So we've been able to add a lot more folks. Edsel Ford was there. Not the primary members of the Astor family, but somebody that married into them and then had a kid, kind of became an Astor. That was there at one point. So it's interesting to start to compile a list of the folks who were here beyond just the same 4 or 5 that the stories like to talk about. This was the original appearance of the building, much smaller than the building that was built, and it is not white, which is what we are all accustomed to. And what was really neat is once we actually started discovering new photos of the original building, we actually had a much more detailed understanding of its appearance. So originally we thought it was just a red roof with kind of just a dark wood exterior, which would have been the last one. That was always how it was assumed it was when it was built, but not much detail to it. But we actually, back one more. When we actually look at the pictures, what we were able to find out was the roof itself, of course, was red. The body was a much darker natural wood, but every level had white trim on it. The gablings had white trim on it. And the little just detail work, like the little just hand-carved actual Victorian wood carvings, all were painted white. So it was much more of a gingerbread style appearance to it. And that makes a lot of sense when you think of the style of architecture, which was Queen Anne. And it was a Queen Anne style because it wanted to complement the nature of Bel Air. Bel Air translates to beautiful air, and Bellevue is beautiful view. So to combine all this together, you're going to build a hotel on the highest point of the Florida coastline, so you have a view commanding of the entire region, Bel Air, Bellevue. And so you don't want a building that looks like the Tampa Bay Hotel. You don't want this Moorish palace that's very attention-grabbing and very eye-catching when you're surrounded by pristine Florida wilderness. That makes sense in Tampa because you're across the river from downtown. You're across the river from the rail wharves in downtown Tampa. But in Bel Air, Clearwater is a little village a mile away that you can't even see. There's nothing else visible to see. You don't want this building distracting you away from the nature that you're trying to promote. So that's why this structure was built in a more traditional style of architecture. And this was the best and largest example of this type of building in the American South as well. And so the color scheme was meant to kind of complement this as a wilderness lodge. And so that's one of the first big discoveries we made of the hotel was Morton Plant did not paint the building green and white. That is the general idea that's been promoted for a while. When we found out, when we started looking at a lot of old photos and records, was that there was a different appearance to the building that keeps getting forgotten about. And it took a very long time to accurately figure out when this started and when this ended. But 3 years after the building opened, it had only had this natural appearance from 1897 until 1900. And then, one of the last things that Morton Plant does before the plant system itself actually dissolves and becomes the Atlantic Coastline and just a handful of just non-affiliated companies, Morton Plant decides that every building in the plant system should be painted the colors of the company. So in 1900, we were painted for the first time with a green roof, white trim, but a creamy yellow exterior to it. And that was known as plant yellow. And when you think of the East Coast, Flagler's hotels had the same color scheme. That was known as Flagler yellow. And so these were actually very traditional colors at the time, and that was the way the building looked all the way until 1940. And the year before we closed for World War II, we were painted the ubiquitous color scheme that we have always been familiar with. And then when I mentioned all the records got lost during World War II, with that, all the records that the building had ever looked anything but green and white. So less than 4 years later, when we reopened again to the public, it was always assumed the building was green and white. And so no one had really known about any of the prior stuff. And so we actually, and finally after 3 years after I come up with this, I was able to go to the salvage yard in Tampa, where they still have the components of the hotel, Schiller Salvage. And we found a piece of the exterior paneling, and we were disassembling it, and lo and behold, crumbling white paint, under crumbling white paint is crumbling yellow paint. So I actually sent that off to UF because they're doing a paint analysis, because we don't actually have a color code on what plant yellow was. And I want to know what plant yellow is, so I can just do that when I'm designing things. So we're actually going to get the color code for plant yellow so we know accurately what the hotel had looked like. These are the things that keep me up at night. Henry Plant dies, Morton Plant takes over, and it's really Morton Plant that becomes the most significant individual in the hotel's history. Henry Plant established it as a Gilded Age hotel for the wealthy, kind of as a wilderness lodge. Morden plant establishes it as the golf capital of the southern U.S. and expands the hotel into the form that we are familiar with it today. And so he ends up rapidly expanding the hotel. This was the original building in here, and we have 3 different expansions all in one shot in here. This is how it had looked by 1914. And each one of the expansions of the hotel coincided with an expansion of the golf courses. Now, it is the first hotel to have a golf course in Florida. Not Florida's first golf course. That was down in Sarasota in 1883. By John Hamilton Gillespie, actually built the one in Sarasota. His son ended up becoming Bel Air mayor during World War II, and then was drafted in the middle of when his mayor term was. And so there's still a lot of connections from the plant years that kind of existed into the town up until about the mid-40s. And so to accommodate all the golfers that were coming into these expanded golf courses, Morden Plant expanded the hotel as well. It ultimately became the 2nd largest occupied wooden building in the country. And that might raise a few eyebrows. Actually, I'll save that one for a minute on that. Because that raises a few eyebrows when I say that. There's a reason for that. You can see the railroad tracks coming right in here on the southern side of the building. We had direct rail service to the hotel until 1940. And then that's when just the tracks were ripped up by the same manager that actually refurbished the building by painting it white, had also removed the railroad tracks that year. I am still confirming this, but I believe that it was one of the last buildings in the American South that still had direct service by train, the last hotels. The exception might be the Breakers in Palm Beach, and I'm having a hard time finding some of the timetables for that, so if anybody knows where I can find those, that might be good. But if we were not the last hotel, we were probably the 2nd to last hotel, really, that still had train service that far into the 21st century. Most railroad hotels had burned down or closed already by the 1940s. In 1911, all these expansions prompted the construction of the 3rd and final dining room for the hotel, which is the one that became one of the biggest symbols of the entire Bellevue, and that would become the Tiffany room. And so you had 96 panels of stained glass on the ceiling. You also had side panels and transoms of stained glass. There's about 15 different stained glass designs in the hotel. However, and kind of the other interesting thing is, as far as we can tell, it is not actually designed by Louis Tiffany. Now, there's 2 folds to that. First part is, we do not have any concrete records of the hotel prior to World War II. So we don't have any receipts of installation or just who did we get them from, who built them. The other half of this is the new records that we have in the newspapers and the documents of the era that describe the hotel. And in all the newspaper descriptions we have from the year when this was built, and even the years following, it mentions the Tiffany room and the stained glass and the beauty, but it never mentions Tiffany stained glass. And you would think that if it was a Louis Tiffany designed product, there would be some type of, conspicuous consumption. You would have mentioned somewhere that this is Louis Tiffany. And the first mentions we see that this actually is Tiffany glass came from the late 1960s when the hotel's trying to compile as much information as possible about themselves to eventually become on the National Register. So what I believe partly had happened was you had a presumption that a ritzy hotel will have Louis Tiffany items, because why not? As well as just a generalization of, oh, well, it looks similar in design, so it probably is. And I think that's kind of where that idea came from. We still do not have bona fide this is or is not, but even the Morris Museum in Winter Park has even said that this is, if it is Louis Tiffany, it's unsigned, which would be unusual, but there's no, at the moment, proof that it is Louis Tiffany glass. Not quite the original lobby, this is actually from the mid-1910s, but what's kind of neat about this, it is one of the only photos we have of the lobby, just from this far back in time, and this is a portion of what still exists today. So these 2 columns here was the original exterior wall, but of course as the hotel was expanding, we did expand the lobby, and the expanded part of the lobby on the back side of those columns, that has all been removed currently. But the actual lobby itself is still there today, and that is what's still in use. And what was neat about the lobby is there is not, again, these were exterior walls originally. The original main lobby does not have a single support column holding up anything above it. And that was done intentionally by Henry Plant. The other big theme that we learned about the hotel kind of in the last few years, everything about it was designed to complement the nature that surrounded the hotel. Belleview, Bel Air, the architectural style of the building, the fact it was located on the highest point of the coastline, to drive home just the absolute beauty and all of these concepts of just the Florida wilderness together. Henry Plant required the lobby of the hotel to not have a support column so that his guests could have an unobstructed view out the windows with nothing in their way to the beauty that used to surround the hotel. And so that is why there's not a single support column. And the building itself is actually suspended within its own framework. Like a suspension bridge is held up by the cables on either side. There are 39 metal rods in the actual lobby itself that go all the way into the main frame of the hotel. And that is what is supporting that massive clear span of the main lobby. And so that is still one of the traits we have. It is still suspended to this day. We have the part of the wall itself is cut open where you can see one of these internal supports and one of the big metal nuts that's right on top of the wood beam.
Joey, what year was that?
This photo was taken, I believe this is around 1914. This would have been right after they had expanded the lobby. We actually didn't build the porte cochere at the hotel until 1914 because everybody had always come in by train. And motoring had become such a fad by the 1910s that they had decided to build a car garage and the actual carport of the hotel. And now, of course, that is the main method of arrival. That is the lobby again. This itself is still here as well. Of course, these were also exterior columns. This is the main front door today. So everything behind these two columns is gone, but everything on this side is still here because this is still the main staircase in the lobby. The entranceway to the hotel as well largely still looks more or less the same. They actually replaced these in 1977. They were the same type from 1922 till 77 was the same lampshades there. And then when U.S. Steel was building all the condos around it is when they kind of did the final aesthetic change to the property. It even says here, speed limit is 12 miles an hour, do not go over. And it was a single lane until they actually had built those condos in the 70s. This is the only building still here to this day. You'll see other photos of it later. There were 15 cottages that were built surrounding the hotel. And this is basically, if you had the money for a spare home, which of course the wealthy of the hotel did at the time, they could build their homes around the property if they wanted to. And that was common for a lot of these Gilded Age hotels. You do see this elsewhere. But what made it unique about the Bellevue is that they were just more successful. And that's kind of also why I'm studying this for school, because this technically, in most ways of how you look at it, was the most successful Gilded Age hotel really in the southern United States. Comparable to the only other two major ones that you can still think of that do still operate similarly, which is the Del Coronado and the Grand Hotel. The Del, the Grand, and the Bellevue Biltmore were considered the last three of America's wooden hotels before the Bellevue fell. But again, asterisk, because we still have a portion of the building there. So when I was talking about the color scheme to the building, this is the best example that we have. And you actually can see it in black and white photos when you can recognize the color differences and the contrasts. But every time I tried showing this to somebody who knew the history of the hotel and I had them explain it, they're like, oh, it's just the color of the paper the postcards put on. Oh, it's just discolored old paper. And I'm like, but this doesn't look it to me. Like, my historian's eye tells me that this is paint. And that's why it was so long to verify that the building was this color scheme. But a lot of people always think, too, it's like a weird color, like green, yellow, and white. When you kind of see it all together, it really does complement a lot of just the nature in the trees that had surrounded the hotel.
You're good.
There we go. Of course, golf courses had always been reconfigured and expanded. At one point, right off where the trains arrived from, that about 50 feet gap between the hotel and the railroad tracks was a putting green in the middle 1910s. Everything was, the hotel was did what was called continual refurbishment. And that was kind of just common for these really big seasonal hotels, is in the off months, the off season, the summer months, they would spend all this money to kind of refurbish the hotel because you're only going to use it for 4.5 months out of the year. The hottest, most weather detrimental time of the year, no one's going to be in it, it's effectively abandoned. You have a lot of work to do to get ready for the season. So that's when we would see improvements done to the building, modifications, renovations. But that, and we'll get to this later too, but for those who saw the building from the 1990s onwards, y'all realize that continual refurbishment doesn't necessarily translate to this is a needed renovation. Just more of the building again, just always sitting pretty on the hill looking over the water. I think, is this the word? Yeah. So this is kind of neat. This was actually the only postcard we had of the World War II years. But what was cool was during the war years themselves, we were an Army Air Corps training facility for Group Replacement Training Group C, which was based out of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was the headquarters, and you had a handful of hotels in St. Pete. That was Division A. Division B consisted of the Fenway Hotel up in Dunedin, and Group C consisted of the Grey Moss Inn, the Fort Harrison Hotel, and the Belleview Biltmore. And the Bellevue Biltmore was so large that they actually, when they would do the parades, like the military review parades, all 3 training centers would muster at the Bellevue because we could hold that many people. The capacity of the hotel was sitting, in general, it was sitting at around 1,500 guests, civilian. Military rolls in and we have about 6,000 at a given time. There are stories, they were 10 to a room, and they had to take the doors off the rooms to accommodate everybody just to fit in the building. And for 1 year, we were Army Air Corps barracks, and that was just common for what you see of a lot of the big hotels throughout the country at the time. During this process as well, to prepare for the Army, the owner had taken everything out of the building and put it into storage. And when the lease to the Army ended, he chose to not keep the building basically for himself. He just sold the property and chose to not put anything back in. So not only did all the furniture, artwork, and kind of accoutrements of the hotel just get shipped off to other facilities, but the office documents, the anecdotal history of the building, photographs probably of Morden Plant and Henry Plant there, just any history of the building never came back inside. And that is what became known as the period of historical amnesia. And that has probably been one of the biggest detrimental effects in the building's history, because when it reopened, and for Bernie Powell's years and pretty much the whole rest of the hotel's existence, we didn't have any understanding whatsoever of the pre-World War II years, which really are the most significant years for a railroad hotel. And that's what we were able to learn a lot about with the internet, as I was saying. And on that train of thought, we had never had a picture of any service member at the Bellevue Biltmore before, up until a few months ago, when we were using these new tools in newspaper archives to search for them. And so the first ever picture we were able to find of the soldiers was doing their drills directly in front of the building. We had never seen this, this wasn't known 8 months ago. And so that's really kind of neat. And as we kept digging through the newspapers, we find all just the accounts of when the Army had moved in and just what a big deal it was, because 6 months, not even 6 months prior to this, about 4.5, it was still open for the 1942 season. We closed at the end of the 1942 season, which was at the end of March, and by August 1st, the Army had moved in. So it really was kind of this big shocking idea that this formerly ritzy hotel is now having a bunch of the public who would never really be able to see a building like this before, is now going in at this swanky hotel. I mean, I love the headline because they were just all dumbfounded by this. And what's also kind of cool is because of the actual carved wood in the staircase, there's only one staircase of the 7 in the hotel that looked like that, and that was the main lobby, which is still there. So we were able to take this photo and do an exact carbon copy with the current lobby today of the soldiers going up the stairs, because we don't really have documentation. They actually didn't even do that in the original building, like in the 90s or the 2000s. Nobody had really ever done like before and afters of anything. And there's a few more that were put in there, just kind of them all moving in. The photo on the right is it's not the best quality, but the reason I like that is because it is the only view of the hotel that I've actually seen consistently across the centuries. It's looking up the terrace, because again, we're on the bluff of Bel Air, so just immediately west you started going downhill. It was terraced out with this staircase. And so there's just always postcard views that existed of just the west facade of the hotel and just that carriage porch and those stairs. There's an 1898 photo of this exact area with bicyclists. There's a 1914 postcard of this exact view. There's a 1942 picture of this exact view. There's another one from the 50s, one from the 70s, one from the 90s. And it's the only actual set of photos we have that we can do this to of the hotel, because nothing else had ever been consistently taken photos of. I mean, always like moved around or a different angle or something, but almost consistently this spot's the only one. So it's been cool to compare all that together. That was one of the big reviews when they had everybody coming up here for it. It was really kind of neat. Again, these are the only records of what life at the hotel and Bel Air was like. Bel Air as a town, it's a little bit of a sidebar for this one, but Bel Air as a town was the hotel. The current town of Bel Air incorporated in 1925, and it really was both entities. And the issue that became of this, and this is a whole separate lecture because it's still jumbled up in my head. But essentially what happened was the hotel manager became a real estate developer during the Florida land boom of the 20s, and then also became mayor of the new founded town. So he held 3 roles, but it was all the single, it was just a branch of basically the same entity. And so when the Florida economy collapses in the late 20s, he took out about $1.5 million in the name of the town and town tax rolls that were done to improve the hotel. And so when the debt came due, the town's 5 residents at the time were like, "We're not going to pay for that. You shouldn't have done that." 15-year litigation. And then at that point, there had not been anybody else living in the town because they were all hotel guests that had built winter homes and then kind of stayed. So when the town went bankrupt at the end of the 20s because the money was spent on the hotel instead, it ended up, the town basically got abandoned. The streets became overran, they didn't have money for the power at any point. And then all the town's male residents got drafted to World War II, and so there was only a population of about 4 for the rest of World War II. And there's really, it's still very murky because then if you actually look at like modern documents on Bel Air history, it then jumps back in like the middle 1950s. So there is a little bit of a murky period between the end of this litigation, this commandeering of the hotel, and then the current town kind of building up to what we have now. I'm still exploring that because it was such a very contentious lawsuit that I also think that's partially why the hotel records were lost. There's enough contentiousness going on. Oh, the hotel's about to close for the war anyway. Maybe we should just let bygones be bygones. And we're still figuring that one out. More World War II. It's kind of neat. We line these up on the golf courses where these were, just by matching up the trees in the background. When we were talking about the second largest occupied wooden building in the country, what's significant about that is no one had ever actually calculated the square footage before, and it was always presumed that it was one of the largest buildings. Because you walked into the old hotel and it's like, this building's massive, and it'd be any bigger. But what we ended up finding out when we crunched the numbers was it's actually the second largest occupied building. They used to say we were 860,000 square feet, but it took me a long time to do this, but if we were to match up the square drawings of the building that we ended up making, the building does not exceed about 360,000. And we even counted the cottages and all the outbuildings. So how does 360,000 actual square feet become represented at 860,000? And this is another example of how, even though no matter how hard we try, we always have to do our best to preserve knowledge as accurately as possible. Cursive is great to teach so that you learn what it says, but not to write documents in anymore. Because what ended up happening, and I'm almost certain that this is what happened because I just don't think it could be any other way. I ended up, racked my brain for this for years, found a document in the basement archives that did the square footage of the building, and they were going to write down 360,000. And because it's in cursive and because they were sloppy, the 3 looked like an 8. And to this day, you still see things published about the hotel that says 860,000 because that number became prevalent in everything published. Remember, nothing original survived prior to World War II. It was always what the hotel kind of just figured out on their own after the fact from volunteers. So it was neat to really go through and actually do a square footage comparison and then find out the Del Coronado Hotel in San Diego is about 30,000 square feet larger. So they're the largest wooden structure in the country. Right behind them was us. Then third place is the Grand Hotel in Michigan, of course. They got the world's largest front porch.
And the best lake.
I've heard that too.
Probably the most rocking chairs.
Yeah. And the other neat things, we actually didn't know the north wing of the hotel was built in 2 phases because we never really had any concrete details and everything was lost. It was just assumed the north wing was built all together. But in reality, first part was 1910 and then the second part was 1914. And so those are just more details that we're firming up. The property, by time it was about to reopen from World War II, you can see a few of the cottages that had surrounded the hotel all in here. The Cabana Club was the beachfront property. Does anybody remember going to the Cabana Club? Yeah. So the neat thing is, this was always assumed that this was the first version of it. And then we found through postcards, there was another entire version of the Cabana Club built in the 1920s that no one knew existed because no one had seen those postcards really until recently again. And this was just the beach facility. What folks don't understand or did not realize after a while was that when Henry Plant purchased the land for the Bellevue, it was 1,000 acres. 300 acres of that are the mainland, are on the mainland today. It's basically the footprint of the Bel Air Country Club. The footprint that I was showing you all earlier, that black and white one, which basically is the country club and the space right around the hotel. That was 300 acres. The remaining 700 was everything north of Indian Rocks Beach on Sand Key. That was the private island of the Bellevue Hotel. And because again, Henry Plant realized this is the Bellevue. Our beautiful view is based on the natural assets that we can see from here. So I'm going to buy the northern third of the island as a permanent asset for the hotel so that it may never lose the view that makes it so grand. And so you look at a lot of maps, and it actually, the maps don't ever say it's private, Hotel Bellevue. It just doesn't show anything there. So you don't really realize looking at the maps that it's actually the private property of the hotel. And it had remained all that way really up until the very late 1960s, early 1970s when U.S. Steel had started to buy the land. The hotel actually lost control of it during the World War II years. For those familiar with Ed Wright, he actually purchased the entire hotel after the war, and then he's the one who divested the island property from the mainland property. And that's why that's actually not considered Bel Air today, because it was originally in Bel Air Heights. And they have just a little different, just cabana buildings you would go to out there. None of the bridges had been built yet, nor were any of the roads viable enough to get yourselves out there. So all the way up until the middle 1990s, so actually just under 100 years, they had a powerboat, just a whole fleet of speedboats that would just go the 1.5 miles between the hotel and the Cabana Club, just because that was the way just to get out there at the time. By the time the hotel closed in 2009, we had a private shuttle that would just drive you across the bridge and back, but I think taking the boat's a little bit much more Florida fun. I just love this shot, just a moment in time, just suspended in the air, I love it. That was the old pool building that had been built there. $1 million pool to build, mosaic tiles imported from Italy. What is really neat, we had always known Mr. Rogers had stayed at the hotel. What we didn't realize, because we didn't have the data at the time, was how young he was. We thought he came as an adult, he came as a kid. Because his grandparents had a home in Clearwater, on the northern end of Clearwater. So every winter he would come down here with his family and just spend the winter season and stay at the Belleview Biltmore. And he loved swimming, absolutely loved swimming. And so it's in the newspapers that 12-year-old Mr. Rogers annually, for about 4 years in a row, won the hotel's swimming competitions after learning how to swim in the hotel pool. And so that's just kind of a neat little story, because most of us are familiar with Mr. Rogers through Rollins College in Central Florida. not realizing that he had a much local connection as a young kid. And what's also cool, so mother's maiden name was McFeely, because that's where some of the names of the show came from. If you actually look back in the historical record, his mother and grandfather came to the hotel back in the early 1910s when she was a little girl, and then he came back obviously a generation later. Mr. Rogers' son lives in one of the new townhomes that was built on the location of the old hotel. So weirdly enough, the family has always kind of just lived on the hotel property for a while. That's kind of neat to think of that his son comes in every now and then and he's always telling me, oh, I got more pictures I gotta show you. These are just some of the advertisements. That was another one of the cabana clubs from the 1960s. Golf is really still what had promoted the hotel so heavily. We were really considered one of the best golf courses in the southern United States, all the way up until about the 1970s. Now the Bel Air Country Club today still is renowned as one of the better courses. Part of the difference stemmed from once the condo developments had started to build up around it, it made it a little bit harder to maintain the view. And similarly, what we see in the 1970s as well is the owners of the U.S. Steel condos had wanted to have a say in membership at the actual golf club that was owned by the hotel at the time. So they formed a new members-only golf organization that ended up getting the deed to the country club, and that is how the Bel Air Country Club itself was founded. It's actually not the same entity from 1897. I actually think they were founded in 1900. There are so few records of that I'm not surprised that's a little bit murky. It's not technically the same entity as today, but it is a descendant of the original Bel Air Country Club, and that is still operating. So it actually had split from the hotel in 1986. And at that point, when the hotel no longer physically owned or controlled the golf courses, that culminated 12 years of the hotel really starting to lose a lot of its allure. The views around the hotel had started to go away as they had started to develop Sand Key and just develop the greater waterfront area. The property around the hotel that was this pristine kind of park space now has the U.S. Steel condos that had surrounded the hotel still do. And then it really had culminated in no longer having complete total access of the golf courses. And all that combined is ultimately why the hotel started to fall out of favor in the late 80s, early 90s, and just no longer really had that business. The other thing too to realize is when all this was happening to the Biltmore, and in the years prior to this, prior to the 1980s, there still had not been a lot of other upscale hotels in the area. The Vinoy was still closed. The Don Cesar actually had just reopened, that was 1975. So the Don was kind of new on the scene, being up and coming, but they hadn't really built much else yet on Clearwater Beach that was new or upscale enough. So around this time is when we start seeing the first of the major beach hotels, and that's also what took away a lot of the business from the Biltmore, which then later coincided with the Japanese years when we were owned by the Japanese Mido company, which I think might be a few more slides in the future. Before I get ahead of myself, Cabana Club again. This is some neat, that's another one of those same photos I was telling you, we have like 7 or 8 from that same perspective. That's another one of those. Miles O'Brien, the CNN announcer, is that one. I guess he was friends with the hotel owner. We have them staying at the hotel now, actually, the family of the owner, Bernie Powell, for about 45 years. They do stay about once a year, various times, so I'm always picking their brain. Golf, again, is what had made us just most well known. When we actually designed the museum exhibit for the Clearwater Museum, we took the one on the right and the font and made the actual poster out of the image on the right. Just golfers landmark. I love this because I love shuffleboard, so it's just kind of fun that we had this right on the front of the hotel. And of course, that is still the building that exists today, that central perspective. It's about 10% of the original hotel. The lobby, again, a little bit closer to what it looks like nowadays. And this is one of the last photos we have of the hotel at all, prior to the actual development of Sand Key. This was taken in April of 1971. Bellevue Island is still kind of undeveloped in the mid-ground, and then the background is still Sand Key Park. And then we don't have any of the condo development yet on the building side. That would all take place kind of on this green space right here in the foreground, right up really in the years right after this. These photos also were from the 70s. And that's what we start to see in here, is we start to see the dredging out of the Finger Lakes, or the Finger Islands, I should say, out on the intercoastal. Bellevue Island is also being re-dredged to be prepared for that development in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that's what it became once all that development had been put in around the building. This was hugely contentious in Bel Air. I'm still going through a lot of the newspapers today, actually, on these ones. It was largely contentious because the town really did want to be able to have more residents and have better density, but at the same time did want to maintain at least some of the air of just the genteel around the hotel. So it was really difficult getting the process for putting these condos in, but ultimately U.S. Steel did build 4 of these condos, and then a different set of developers built another 5 in the surrounding area. So there are 9 condos immediately surrounding the building, and then Bellevue Island was built in the was developed in the 1990s. Bellevue Island, that little middle one, if you look on a map, it looks like a teardrop attached to the side of the area. That is not original. That was built in 1926. It was actually supposed to be the hotel's yacht club and shooting range. And they got as far as building the island went before the economy collapsed, and then it remained completely vacant all the way until the 1990s. When I mentioned earlier that not a lot of people realize that Henry Plant owned the northern third of Sand Key, it's because all the documentation from when the hotel opened talks about the private barrier island owned by the hotel, but in the modern years, we only know of the island owned by the hotel right off the coast. So that was the red herring that made a lot of people not realize that we actually did own Sand Key until we figured that out. And so that was really kind of neat. When the Japanese owned the building, they had actually added a few modifications to the building that did end up making it less popular. Japan's economy was just booming all the way through the very early 90s. And so when they bought the hotel, this was added to a portfolio of about 300 Gulf resorts around the world. And in doing so, it did mark kind of the final death knell for the building, because they had built a pagoda entrance, which is what you see on the front. Y'all are going to laugh at this. I have met 2 people in the last 5 years of doing this that actually thought the pagoda was a good idea. Exactly. I get that all the time. Tomatoes. I get tomatoes thrown at me usually when I talk about the pagoda, so I have to like... They built the pagoda on the front end in here. They expanded what became the Terrace Cafe. They kind of built a new patio to it. But they also started to demolish some of the outbuildings that were dilapidated that really preferably should have been saved, but it was going to be phase 2 of the renovation that they ended up not having the money for. And so all this together is what made the Japanese ownership of the hotel very unpopular. It returned to American ownership in the late 90s. Unfortunately, at that point, they had put so much money into the other parts of the hotel that they didn't actually upkeep the building. And this is the first time that the hotel's rooms have to start being closed off. And so after 1997, the 5th floor was closed. Then a few years later, the 4th floor closed. And then the 3rd floor. And by the time the entire building closed in 2009, only 110 rooms in the entire structure were occupiable. Now the interesting thing about that is if you go back, and that's the full-sized massive building, if you go back to the original 1897 building that was about a tenth of the size, it had 113 guest rooms. The full-sized building closed with less amount of rooms available than the original smaller did when it opened, because that much of the building was starting to deteriorate at this point. Which, let's see what follows here. There's another one that's kind of that same lobby that we see. Again, the right half is still the room today, the left half is not. They did not keep the original check-in desk. I think that became a bar somewhere, if I remember correctly. And that's essentially in the similar view of what it looks like today. So the building had closed in 2009 for what was supposed to be a 3-year total overhaul. Having only had continual refurbishment, it really needed the full TLC, especially, again, I never got to see the old building, but from what I've been told from everybody who saw this from the 90s onwards, it really needed some TLC. So we did close the end of May of '09 for what was supposed to be a 3-year renovation. However, that coincides with the first Great Recession of the last decade. So all the investors pulled out, all the capital dried up, the building's now already shuttered and in limbo, and now no one really knows what to want to do with it. There was a lot of support by residents in the town to save the building, but there was also a lot of support by residents in the town not to, because there was such a large amount of work to be done that no one had known really where to start. And every developer had kind of come in and said the same thing, like, we would like to save the building, but everything needs to be renovated in some way. Where do we even begin? And all the while that this limbo is happening, more and more of the building is being deteriorated. It's about 2014, the current owner bought the building, and some of the residents in the immediate condos surrounding the hotel were like, look, we don't want to see an abandoned building anymore. It's been closed about 5 years at this point. Our property values were starting to go down at that point, coupled with the similar desire by the country club to not have their guests see a white elephant of a hotel anymore. All these factors together is what had really pushed into the redevelopment of the hotel. Itself being very contentious, just given that we had a lot of the preservationists involved, and it still came back to, okay, well, we would like it saved, but how can we even start this project? So the middle ground that the owner had chosen to take was the vast majority of the building would be removed or deconstructed, and they would save only the central lobby from the 1897 building. That would be preserved, renovated, relocated 350 feet east, and then restored as what's now the Belleview Inn. And so that is ultimately what happened. This building is about 10% the size of the building that everyone remembers, the full-sized hotel. This section of the building is about 70% of the original 1897 footprint. So again, the hotel expanded so much. This is a small portion of what it was, but it's a large portion of what it originally was built as. So that's how the trade-off was seen. At least it's something, because really every other hotel like this doesn't get at least a second version of life. It usually always is a complete demolition. The last major hotel like this to be demolished in Florida was Henry Flagler's Ormond Hotel. That was in 1992. And that was after spending 60 years as a retirement home, and there's just no other use for the building at that point. So we are glad that at least a fraction of this got saved. It is no longer on the National Register of Historic Places because you are not allowed to relocate a historic structure from its original location and maintain that registry. Because then it messes up the people like me who have never been there and are trying to find an obscure railroad tie buried in the ground, and it's a lot easier when you can go out the back door, pace out 30 feet, and then dig and find something. You can't really do that when you move the building, so that's why we don't get that historic listing. The exception would have been had we rebuilt and restored the hotel to its original appearance. So think of Heritage Village and the homes and the buildings there. Some of them are on the National Register because they were restored to the original descriptions of what they looked like. We really couldn't do that to the Bellevue because it really did need to be modernized and updated, so that's also partially why. I don't know if there's another. I do have one more thing. Because after all was said and done, we reopened at the end of, we reopened at the end, there we go. Reopened at the end of 2018. December 2018 is when we opened. I started in May of the following year. And we are 35,000 square feet down from 360,000 square feet. We are 35 nicely renovated hotel rooms down from 455. But we are still able to have guests stay at the oldest hotel in Tampa Bay, and we're really glad for that. At the moment, there is not public history tours of the building anymore. They did stop those recently. But that might, the town centennial for Bel Air is coming up within a year, so I think we are trying to work on getting some public tours going on in the future. So keep y'all's eyes peeled for later this year into next year for those as well. I did the Ollie tours as well through Eckerd College. I've seen you in I think you've been in every one of my classes so far.
Pretty much.
And so I try to do those as often as possible. Those are also on a temporary hiatus while the hotel's restructuring. The hotel decided to not lean into their history after 5 years, so they did a restructuring of the actual organization of the hotel and a retheming. So they're not leaning into the history of the building themselves, so we're gonna figure out how to still do the semi-public tours that we were doing as a third party. And we're still working that out, so at the moment I cannot tell you to come visit me. But soon, we'll keep our eyes peeled. I love questions, please ask me questions. If anybody brought stuff, I know that was promoted on some of the pamphlets, if anybody brought like photos or anything, we'll work out a process to how to get them all scanned in and digitized and put into the historic record, and we can deal with that on the side, so, yes.
I was fortunate enough to go into the old building where they used to have the main room that they did conferences, like a conference center. Does this one have conference capabilities?
Yes and no. Everything's been downsized immensely. So the old hotel, you could have 3 weddings and 2 conferences at the same time without any overlap, holding hundreds and thousands of people. The maximum size we can do on an event at the current hotel is about 80 people. So yes, we do have ability to do something, but it is on a severely reduced scale compared to what it was. We do not have a food service license for our property. It's shared with the hotel we're affiliated with. And so it's a catering kitchen, but we do not have a liquor license. So it's like a boutique hybrid type thing.
You had said something to the effect that Sam Key Newark was part of plans. There used to be in the early 90s on Clearwater Beach, past the roundabout, a white building with a green roof, like a Clearwater
Beach Hotel.
Is that what it was?
Yes.
Okay.
So that was one of the older hotels built on Clearwater Beach. It was also technically considered the fanciest hotel that wasn't the Biltmore out in that area. And that actually had survived all the way until 2005 when the Sand Pearl Hotel demolished it and was built on its place. Which, ironically, because my favorite phrase as a historian is everything's connected. So the Sand Pearl Hotel bought the site of the Clearwater Beach Hotel and built that on it. The developer of that is the same developer that purchased the Belleview and redid the entire property. So they built the Sand Pearl, and then they were in charge of, years later, redoing our hotel and building the condos. That's technically why the Bellevue has a partnership with Sand Pearl. But that was on the north side of that, yeah.
Thank you. I have one other question. Sorry, I don't mean to trump. I'm sorry. You mentioned that Clearwater Historical Society Museum has a display there on the floor.
They had it was a temporary exhibit. We just ended that in the middle of February. I believe this all happened so quickly from the last time I was there. I believe someone did end up purchasing all the exhibit panels. It was supposed to be temporary because they were just going to reuse them for the next display. And I think enough people wanted them permanent that I think someone donated the money for that. I'm still figuring that out because the idea was that we did have interest from other museums that had wanted that. The Heritage Village had mentioned it as well. We probably will end up displaying it in Bel Air next year for the centennial, more than likely. So there is options for it to travel, and we're still going to figure out the protocols for that, but I can definitely let you know you actually have the perfect space for it in here. This is the right size
We just
for
had
it.
the Deer Beaches, well, it was Heritage Village that gave it to us through the libraries, or through the museum that USF had put together.
Yes.
And that was here from, it was 6 months, September till the beginning of January. And that was a nice piece to have with all their displays.
I'm hoping to structure that similarly as well because it is a good little, they're just doors. It's just a little wooden door that we put the stickers on, but I got the actual, I'll send you the panels because we have them all digitized, like, I mean, so they're just PDF, I'll just send you the PDF. So I hand over there.
Was the Platte Railroad narrow gauge and did it end at the Biltmore?
Yes and no. So with the way the gauges work, narrow gauge at the time was cheaper to build, and Henry Plant did not exactly build with narrow gauge if he didn't have to. He had purchased the Orange Belt Railroad in 1895. Now the Orange Belt is what founded St. Petersburg. It was not built by Henry Plant, that was built by Peter de Menz, and that was narrow gauge. Henry Plant purchased it in 95, it took him 5 years to standardize it, and then he rebuilt all the tracks to standard gauge. So when the Biltmore itself opened, they actually were standard gauge tracks for the hotel. They did not replace them there, and everything south had to end up being standardized to them.
So it did continue on from here?
Yeah, so it would have been one train from the north going south, one train from the south going north, and just on their trip in or out of the Pinellas Peninsula, they would have backed into the hotel and then out. So kind of like when you take the Amtrak to Tampa now, you got to back in at Tampa Union Station. You would have had to do the same thing at the Bellevue, which, you know, it doesn't matter which way the train's going. Sometimes if you're coming from the north, you would probably end up backing into the hotel because it's quicker to leave if you're just however they had done that, but they would have backed in. That's all Hopeville.
From whom did Henry Plant purchase the land? Was it from the federal government?
So before the Bellevue was built, Charles Johnson's the homesteader that's recorded for being in this area, and he was a schooner captain that had kind of just plied the waters around here, and he just saw the really high bluff near where Clearwater Harbor was, and just built his homestead there. We have verbal records he was there, and we have the homestead record that he was there. We don't have any photographs or any descriptions of the property, where on site the home was compared to where the hotel would be built. If there's any house left when Henry Plant purchased it, we don't have those types of records, but there was actually a homesteader there previously.
And a second brief question. Did Morton Plant get compensated for allowing the Army Air Corps to get into, to use the hotel? Was he compensated for that by the federal government?
So, yes and no. Morton Plant had died in 1918, and then had been part of the Biltmore Hotel chain throughout the 1920s. The manager from the Biltmore chain is the one that had the financial problems with the hotel, the town, and the bonds. And so then it was in receivership for 8 years. So actually by the time the Army had us in 1942, it was owned by actually just a Chicago-based hotel gentleman. It wasn't Plant involved at all. He did get paid for it. It actually was it was cheaper to lease the hotel than it normally would have been, because the way that its standard worked out, if the military came in for wartime hotels, you would have paid a higher price to the hotelier, because when the Army handed the keys back to the public, the beds had to be made, flowers had to be in the vase, pens had to have ink, and you basically would have given the keys to the civilians and then given the first room key to the guest. The Bellevue was cheaper to rent because we didn't require it to come back in ready condition. We said, okay, you can just give it to us as is. And so it was cheaper to rent out, but because of that, the hotel was completely empty of everything. And that's why it took about 3 years to get it restored again for public use.
You mentioned Biltmore. Is this Biltmore connected to the other Biltmore?
That's the fun thing that we also got to learn about, because there is no record of that. Now, we are the Bellevue Biltmore Hotel because we became part of the Biltmore Hotel chain in 1919. That's when the name was added to us. And we had always known that we are Biltmore because of the Biltmore Hotel chain. What no one had seemed to have bothered to figure out before was why the Biltmore Hotel chain was named Biltmore in the first place. Because the word Biltmore etymologically comes from the Biltmore estate in North Carolina. It was coined expressly for them. And we do not have any Vanderbilt connection to the Bellevue Hotel. But because decades have gone by, everybody had always thought Biltmore, right? Well, the Vanderbilts must have given you money. The Vanderbilts must have stayed there and you named it after them. The Vanderbilts must have done something to cause this, right? And we never really knew what to say other than, no, it's the hotel company. I went to the Biltmore estate and asked them, and they didn't even know there was a Biltmore Hotel. This is what I get. Every time I've been trying to find something out, this is what I walk into. Oh, we didn't even know. Okay, well, thank you for proving my point, but that still doesn't help me prove it any easier. So it took a little bit of time to find this, but what ended up happening was the very first Biltmore Hotel opened in New York in 1912, across from Grand Central Terminal. And it was part of a redevelopment project that the terminal was doing. The New York Central Railroad was redeveloping all of Grand Central Terminal as Terminal City. The Biltmore Hotel was going to be their main hotel. The operators, the owners of the New York Central Railroad by the early 1910s still had a controlling interest by the Vanderbilt family. So when they wanted to build a new hotel across from Grand Central Terminal, they were like, well, we would like to name it after our founding family's grandson's very well-known estate in North Carolina, which had a reputation for being the most elegant home in the country, the most party-ish place in the country, and they wanted to kind of tie all that into the hotel. Within the first year of the Biltmore Hotel being opened in New York, the Biltmore name now became synonymous with high-end luxury hotels rather than just the mansion in North Carolina. And so that technically is where Biltmore came from, and we didn't have any record of that. That wasn't written down anywhere in the old hotel. It was a lot of digging to find that because it should have been more obvious other than Biltmore chain. And so that's where that came from. So we actually got a nice little summary dossier written up about that, because that's one of the big questions we always get. Oh, the Vanderbilts must have stayed here. I did hear that Gloria Vanderbilt stayed in the 1990s. One of the old employees had said that, and they said she was horrible to work for because she was throwing around the idea, well, this is the Belleview Biltmore Hotel, and I'm Gloria Vanderbilt, so therefore you do what I say, or else I'm going to get you fired type thing. And she would always scare all the new hires with that, thinking that she was right, and then they'd go like crying back to their boss, and the manager's like, oh no, she doesn't actually have anything to do with us, she's just an old rich lady, don't worry. And it was like the stories that we heard, we get all the employees that come back all the time with all these really cool stories of what it was like. The wood built out of the hotel, second largest occupied wooden building, the wood itself is so dense that it is mostly fire resistant, but not fireproof. We never had a fire on property at any point. Now, there was an incident in the 90s, there was an arson event. And what we ended up finding out was, about this one was the volunteer fire department for the town of Bel Air. One of the volunteer firefighters was moonlighting as a security officer at the hotel. And to get a little bit of glory, I don't know, over the course of 3 months, lights 2 fires in the building, calls the volunteer fire department of Bel Air to try to get the claim of, saving the hotel from being burned down. And after the second time, the night watchman, who had been there for decades, was like, the hotel shouldn't be catching fire. What's going on here? And he was tried and convicted for trying to arson the hotel. And that was neat. Yeah, the last little fun fact I say, because I can go on for hours about this, and this is still one of my fun ones. Florida Lottery. The very first millionaire's drawing for the Florida Lottery was at the hotel in 1988. And that's also been stricken from the public historical record. I mean, people can remember it, but if you don't remember it, you go to the Florida Lotto website, it just says the inaugural drawing was in Clearwater. Which, okay, fair. Bellevue Biltmore always got dual listed. Clearwater, Bel Air, always. But the weird thing about that is when the idea was, okay, so we're going to do a Florida millionaire's drawing at the Bellevue Biltmore Hotel. We're going to make new money at the home for old money. So we're going to do it at the Biltmore. And it was supposed to be an annual thing. The residents in Bel Air had such a conniption fit that gambling was going on in the town. They only allowed it to happen the one time. And the funny thing is, in the actual articles where the town residents were having this fit over the gambling, they even acknowledged that there was the hidden casino at the hotel for about 40 years. They were fine, they literally say in the article, we were fine with that because it was the Bellevue's guests. But now it's not the Bellevue's guests gambling and we're not okay with that. And it was interesting to kind of see how that had played out just over a few decades later. But it's the very first Florida Lotto drawing, right there, old money and new money. These are the fun things that make learning about this fun. And we do want a lot of this more promoted. I mean, I'm still trying to get some stuff published through the school. We discovered the first ever ghost story at the hotel, verifiable ghost story. Not, I saw an orb or I heard a voice. We found what became a ghost story, but we traced the actual historic event that had started it.
There's a ghost story book about the book.
There is.
Yes, and we had a speaker before the museum. We had a speaker at the rec center. And she came and talked about ghosts Yes, that's what, okay, I haven't heard that in a while.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could go on forever, as Joey said.
And I do, so y'all find me on another time or come up for one of my tours, because I love talking about that.
We may have Joey back just to be able to work through all of our history in our boardroom. If you ever work on another thesis. But in the
Alright.
meantime, I would like to thank Joey Vars for being here and